Now, if you've ever watched my videos before, then you know I'm all about efficiency and productivity. So that means that making sure I understand the most I can in the littlest amount of time in order to maximize my chances of success in classes. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the 3 main study tips that you need to know going into this new 2021-2022 year, whether you're in undergrad, graduate school, or any other school, and you want to maximize your chances of doing well in classes. Now, if you just came here to find the 3 tips, then I'm basically going to talk about active recall and why you need to use that for any class that requires a lot of rote memorization, practice problems that you need to use for classes that require anything that has to do with any practice problems at all, basically physics, math, calculus, anything like that, you should use practice problems. And finally, spaced repetition, which is how you study multiple times over a long period of time in order to make sure that you don't forget what you're actually studying. Now, what you shouldn't be doing is reading and highlighting. Now, if this is why you clicked on the video, then thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like down below, and let me know down below in the comments what current study method you use. But if you're interested in learning more on why these specific study habits are the best for maximizing success, I will be detailing in this video 3 different articles that talk about spaced repetition, active recall, and practice problems, and how through peer-reviewed research, these study methods have been proven to be the most successful and most efficient way to study and to do well in your classes. Now, the first study method we're going to talk about is active recall. Now, if you've ever watched my videos before, you know that I'm a big advocate of active recall. But for those of you that are new, active recall is essentially when you test yourself on a concept without looking at the information. So, for example, if I just learned that World War II was from 1939 to 1945, then what I would do, personally, I would make a flashcard about it, and then I would test myself. And if I can actively retrieve that memory from my long-term memory or from my working memory, if I just learned it, then over time, I'll be able to make sure that is fully ingrained in my head, and when test day actually comes, I do the best on my exam. Now, I didn't always use active recall. In the first semester of first year, I actually did really bad in my courses. I don't even want to talk about it. But in Psychology 101, I did really bad because I was studying so wrong. I literally used to reread my textbook and try to understand the information as much as possible. I used to summarize, I used to highlight. I basically used to do everything that you shouldn't be doing in your classes, and I did really bad. I got a 71 in that psych course. Then the next semester, that's when I actually during the winter break, that's when I came around Ali Abdal's active recall video, and that's when I was like, why not incorporate this? I mean, I'm already doing bad. Why not incorporate this in order to do better in school? And that's when I started incorporating active recall and using flashcards, and that's when my grades literally skyrocketed. That second semester, I got a 4.0 in every single one of my classes. I think the lowest grade that I had was a 91, and I did really, really well in my classes, and that's fully attributed to active recall. Now, research also shows that active recall is one of the most effective study methods. There was a big study that took place in Washington University in St. Louis, and what they did is they essentially asked a bunch of students to volunteer, and they organized them into 3 different groups. First group was study, 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 study. So it was 4 blocks of studying. Second group was study, 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 and 1 testing group. And the final group was the study, test, test, test. So the final group took 3 tests and only studied the information once. The second group took 1 test, studied the information 3 times, and the first group didn't test themselves at all. And what they did is they essentially gave them a test on their information that they just learned 5 minutes after they studied the last block, or they tested themselves on the last block. What's funny is that the study group did perform the best in the first 5 minutes after them studying the information, which, yes, okay, that shows that studying is very good for rereading. But they tested them again after 1 week, and they actually found that the study, test group significantly did better than both the other groups, and the study group did absolutely horrendous. They literally did so bad on the exam, and that goes to show that if you just reread something and you try to study it by rereading, or I guess making your own notes, then you don't end up retaining that information for a long period of time. So it essentially only works if you study the information, then you test yourself after for like 5 minutes. And you guys definitely know this. Like, for example, I don't know if someone has ever told you this, but if someone ever tells you, oh, try to remember this number, like they give you, I don't know, like 6 digits, like 403215, right? You'll probably be able to remember it for a minute, 2 minutes, or whatever. But if you test yourself again on those 6 numbers after 1 week, more often than not, you're not going to be able to remember that number. However, if on a daily basis or every 2 or 3 days, you test yourself on that actual number and you try to retrieve it from your long-term memory, then over time, that number will basically be second nature, right? Like, think about it. I mean, everybody has an iPhone or an Android or anything with a passcode, right? Anytime you open open your phone, you kind of put in the numbers in as second nature. It's not like you think about them. It's like your fingers automatically go to these numbers and they automatically set it up. And that's because you always are testing yourself with active recall, in the sense that you're always trying to retrieve those numbers from long-term memory, and they essentially just become a part of muscle memory and you basically never forget them. And that's exactly what happened here in this study, which goes to show that all you really need to do is study the information once and go along into testing yourself nonstop after that. When you don't understand something in the testing phase, whether that's something you forgot or something you want to re-clarify, then yeah, you go back and you study it and you make sure that you better understand it. But once you've done that, then you come back to the testing. And I promise you, if you do this for every single one of your classes that require, memorization, like biology, philosophy, sociology, law, medicine, anatomy, physiology, basically anything that you need to memorize stuff or you need to understand information that doesn't require practice problems, go to active recall, and I promise you, you will not regret it, and you would end up doing way better in your classes if you stick to this method. Now, the second method we're going to talk about is practice problems. Now, another study took place in Washington University in St. Louis. I don't know, man, I feel like they're snapping and they've been doing really well in helping students understand how to study better and how to do better in classes. And what they found is they split 3 different groups. One group did practice tests, one group restudied all the information, so they just reread their stuff, and one group didn't do questions at all. And then they tested all the 3 groups to see who would perform best on the actual exam. And they found that the group that did the practice test did 15% better than the group that restudied the information, who did 15% better than the group that didn't study anything at all. So essentially, if you reread the information, your peak theoretically would be 85%, considering that everybody else does practice tests and gets 100%. But more often than not, if you do practice questions, you could get 100, but more likely you'll get a 90 plus. So let's say you get a 90, then the other people that just restudied the information would get a 75% on their exam, which is actually considerably not high if you wanted to get into a professional school here in Canada. So that's why I think practice questions are very beneficial when it comes to try to do well on your exams that require practice problems. Now, not only that, but they tested them again on new information that was not included in the practice questions, things that they needed to apply their knowledge to through application, right? So that's like asking a bonus question on an exam. Think of it like that. The whole exam was basically bonus questions. And again, they showed that people that did the practice questions ended up outperforming both the restudy group as well as the group that didn't do any study questions at all, or any questions at all for that matter. This goes to show that not only does practice problems help in performing in the regular material that you were supposed to be assessed on, but it also helps when you are applying that knowledge into other harder and more complex questions. So for this reason, I think that practice questions are very beneficial for performing well on classes that require a lot of practice problems and have a lot of problems in the actual exam. Like I said, calculus, physics, organic chemistry, and active recall works very well for courses that you need to memorize information and understand information and ingrain it into your long-term memory to be able to answer, whether that's multiple choice questions, short answer, or long answer questions on courses like biology, sociology, economics, psychology, basically anything that doesn't have practice problems, it would be very beneficial for. Now, how can you make sure that you keep all this information for a long period of time, right? Like if you do active recall for 1 week and then you test yourself again after 1 year, more often than not, you're gonna have forgotten that information because you haven't seen it for at least a week. Same thing with practice problems. If you do a bunch of practice problems in 1 week and you don't keep doing that for a long period of time, you're not gonna end up performing on your exam if that's in like 6 months, because the last time you did practice problems was a bunch of months ago. So that's where the final concept comes in of spaced repetition. Now, spaced repetition is the final study method that we're going to talk about, and this is essentially how you need to make sure that you're doing your practice problems or you're doing your active recall questions a lot of times over a long period of time to ensure that you keep it into your long-term memory and you basically never forget it. So Ebbinghaus is a psychologist that came up with a theory called the Ebbinghaus curve, and this is essentially how your memory over time will, basically deteriorate and get away from your long-term memory, move into your short-term and working memory, and basically eventually just you end up forgetting it. So what he said is that you need to space out the interval of when you retrieve a memory by longer and longer increments over time. So for example, if I just learned when World War I was, so let's say that it's 1914 to 1918. If I test myself today, I want to make sure that I test myself, let's say double or triple the current interval that I have now. So the current interval is 1 day, triple that would be 3 days, then triple that would be 9 days. Then triple that would be 27 days. Then triple that would be So eventually over time, that interval increases and you are still able to retrieve that memory from your long-term memory. And this is basically known as a concept of synaptic plasticity. Now, synaptic plasticity is how the strength between two neurons becomes stronger over time. And this only happens with spaced repetition, where over time you're able to retrieve that information at longer intervals, and that helps it keep it into long-term memory for longer. Now, just to prove to you that spaced repetition actually works, there was a research study conducted at Ohio University. And what they did is they essentially tested people on Spanish translations for English words. They essentially split the people into 3 different groups. Group 1 tested themselves back to back on 6 different sessions for the Spanish to English translation. So their initial retention was very high because they were being tested back to back. So their working in short-term memory was working in overload, and they were able to keep the information for basically the short period of time. The second group had also 6 different test days, except they were split up on every single day. So over 6 days, they had 1 test every single day. So their initial tests were a bit lower because they had a bit more time to forget over a full day. However, over time, they actually ended up performing better than the group that did their tests back to back. Then the final group, which actually tested themselves 30 days between each session. So this session took place over, I guess, 3 months, where they had the same test being presented every 30 days rather than back to back in the first group or after every day in the second group. And what they found is after testing these 3 groups 30 days from the last section, the final group, which is group 3 that tested themselves 30 days between each section, actually ended up performing the best, significantly better than group 1 and group 2. And this goes to show that spaced repetition has a better effect on retaining your memory in your long-term memory over a long period of time than the other 2 groups. So the longer the interval, the longer you can actually keep your memory in long-term memory, and the better you'll actually perform on test day. So group 3 actually scored a 95% on their exam, group 2 scored I think an 82% on their exam, and group 1 scored the worst, which was around a 67% on their exam. So this shows that don't study back to back. It's better to study over long periods of time. So you can incorporate spaced repetition with either practice problems, or you can incorporate spaced repetition with active recall. It doesn't matter, but at the end of the day, you need to be using spaced repetition, and the classes that you'll be taking will either require practice problems or active recall. Now, just to summarize, active recall is when you test yourself on specific concepts and you make sure that you keep it in your long-term memory that you could do very easily through flashcards. Practice problems is very simple. You know, it's very obvious. You just do practice problems for the class. And spaced repetition needs to be coupled with either practice problems or active recall in order for you to best perform on your classes. So forget about highlighting, forget about rereading, forget about summarizing. Stick to active recall, spaced repetition, and practice problems. And I promise you, you will do much better this year than you did the year before and the year before that if you weren't using these study methods before. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you do have any questions, feel free to leave them down below, and also comment, and also don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you did enjoy it. I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care and take it easy.